Welcome, everyone. For those who are watching from the Faith Chinese Alliance Church, this is actually Sunday, and not just any Sunday, but Father's Day. And so happy Father's Day to the many fathers that we have out there. And if you're just watching this on YouTube and are not from the church, happy Father's Day to you. Hopefully you're watching this around that time. And this is not just any Father's Day. This is a very special Father's Day that we also want to remember what is happening in our world today, specifically in our country, in our area, with all the movements that are going on with Black Lives Matter. We want to continue to remember as a church and as followers of Christ that we stand for justice and we stand against injustice. And often you've heard me talk on Father's Day about how I was raised by a single mom. And as I've come to learn more and more over the years, it wasn't anything that I did. I had no special privilege to be able to get to where I am in life, but really it was from the grace of God. I was, in ways, one of the lucky ones. But there are many folks, specifically our friends and our co-workers and those that are in the Black community who don't have that privilege. In fact, I think a statistic that I saw on the internet was that 21% of Asian families actually are raised by a single mom. And for the African American family, basically that's 75% that are raised by a single mom. So to talk about Father's Day for an African American is basically saying, well, they had no father figure. I get that because I know what it was like to be raised by not having a father at home. And I knew what it was like to be embarrassed when you go to school and everybody has their dad or talks about both parents and you don't have that. And my daughter had just showed me a video recently. She said, "Dad, you'd be the guy that's in the back of the line." And I didn't understand at the time what that actually meant. And then I watched the video, and it was about these they looked like college age students that were lined up on a line. It was like a rec time type of thing out on the lawn. And what happens is they were supposed to reach towards this $100 that was out there. And you probably have seen the video. And basically, they tell them to take a certain number of steps. If they didn't have to worry about the meal that they had, they never had to worry about paying bills. They had access to a private education. They had two parents in the home. And and in that video, as it plays out, is that mostly they were the young white students that were able to progress farther along. And it was the African American students that were stuck at the starting line. And the guy that was conducting all this tells all the students to say, "Hey, look behind you. Look how far ahead of you are to many of these other people. And it's not by anything you've done." And when I saw this video, I counted the number of things as to what you would step forward for. And I was like, wow, I would be one of the ones in the back of the line. And I really don't consider that as anything that I've done myself. It really is by the grace of God that I've been able to somehow reach a little farther than many of my African American colleagues and friends and brothers in Christ. And so my heart goes out to the many African Americans that are out there. Black lives do matter. And it's not saying that all lives don't matter. But what it is really saying is that before we can allow all lives to matter, we need to make sure that we're taking care of the injustices that are happening to our Black community. They've been happening for many, many years. And it's because, as many of us know, if you've ever heard the Martin Luther King speech where he talks about, it's offensive for a person to say to an African American, "Hey, Why aren't you like these other minorities that can just pull yourself up by your bootstraps? It's like, and you have to understand, first of all, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, is that they most likely don't have boots. But even more seriously than that is that they were dragged here from another country. And it has taken years and years and years for us to finally make the steps that we can make to further assimilate them into what we call this melting pot of the United States of America. We as Christians, as members of the Christian and Missionary Alliance, if you haven't seen already, share with me my favorite verse. It's found in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. It says, "He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly." That means we love justice, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. This morning, as I share with you a message again from Luke, my hope is that what you'll see in this message is not just a message that just happens to be the next one in line in our series, but when we talk about credibility, we're also talking about our own credibility as individuals, as disciples of Christ, but also for those who are fathers out there, that we long to be credible as dads. And so God bless you, dads, as you share in this message with me. This morning's message is entitled Destined for Credibility, and it's found in Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 35. I want to bring us back to why I use the word destiny to entitle this series of messages. As you can see in the definition here for destiny, it's a predetermined course of events often held to be an irresistible power or agency. And I heard a pastor this past Sunday, his name is Sean Smith, who actually said it this way, that destiny is when you are called and you actually do it. For me, it's all those events, the things that have happened in our lives, the happenstance, the learnings, all those things come together to finally bring us to the point of where God wants us to be and what he wants us to do. I've chosen this background because, as you can see, it gives the different elements as the world thinks of credibility. That credibility is integrity, it's trust, it's being reliable, authentic, having a reputation, regard, as well as a commitment. And today what I'd like to do is show you some elements as Jesus taught about credibility. So today's passage starts in verse 25 of Luke chapter 14. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And anyone who does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Will he not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? For if he lays the foundation and is not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule him, saying, "This fellow began to build and was not able to finish." Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Will he not first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off, and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, any of you who does not give up everything, he cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. At first glance, this is what you see in this passage. You see Jesus with a large crowd that is following him. And How else would we want to be able to ditch the large crowd that follows us? And so he turns to the crowd and he says, if you want to be my disciple, you'll have to hate your father, mother, brother, sister, even hate yourself if you want to be my disciple. And then and if we stop the story there, it would be clear that, oh, Jesus is trying to just lay down some rules to possibly scare off this large crowd. But it actually gets deeper than that, because then he goes into the story about how when you plan for a tower, that you want to make sure that you've counted all the costs, because you don't want to be embarrassed at the end when all your neighbors and friends and everyone else is looking at you to say you couldn't finish the tower. I know I've used this passage many a time to just talk about the whole concept of planning and how we need to count the costs and scope things out. And here's a perfect example of how the Bible tells us that we need to be good in our planning, that it's not just enough to have faith, but there are plans that we need to intentionally go through and plan. Then he goes into this other story or other illustration about, well, if you want to be my disciple, you don't want to be like the guy who goes to war where he has 10,000 troops. And yet, as he faces his enemy, there's 20,000 troops. And if you knew that, you would know that you would try to arrange some type of truce. I looked up Custer's Last Stance, General George Custer, if you remember that whole part of our history, Custer's Last Stance. And apparently he had 700 troops. And at the time, I guess the scouts had told him there was only 800 Indians that were on the other side. Well, what it turns out is later on, it was discovered that there were 1,500 to 2,500 Native Americans that they went into war, and he rushed it too soon. So you can always look that up in the internet to find out the whole story. But here we see almost a parallel situation. You have half the number of troops than the other side has. It seems pretty reasonable to say you're not going to win. And so he sets up this scenario saying, just like a person who goes to war, who's battling someone and sees that there is no chance of winning, that you want to then arrange some other workaround, call a truce. Then he ends this passage talking about salt. Now, they're by the Dead Sea. If you know your topography of the Bible, and you know that the Dead Sea has a whole lot of salt. And he says, if you're like this type of disciple, you're going to be as useless as the salt that we see on the Dead Sea. That's essentially the entire passage. Now, most of us would look at this passage and think of it as just a passage that Jesus is talking about the cost that it requires for discipleship. But I think it goes a lot further than that. It's not just the cost that it entails for discipleship, because often we take that message and say the cost is high, and therefore it needs a high degree of commitment. I think there's actually more to it than that as we look at these two stories. Because in the two stories, what they're mentioning is you don't want your neighbors or your friends or the other folks in the area to be able to look at you and to see that you are a failure, basically. And to me, this lends itself beyond just a commitment to discipleship, but to say that if we're failed disciples, it actually diminishes our credibility. How true that is. Because what do people call us as Christians? We're often known as hypocrites. And so this passage is probably far deeper and more relevant than we see at first glance, because it's actually a passage that talks about credibility. When's the last time you've heard a message on credibility in church? I know I haven't. And often as Chinese, we talk about saving face, and I used to hate it when my mom would say, "You don't want people to talk about you." And I was like, I don't care what people say about me. But here's Jesus saying, "Hey, if you're a committed disciple of Christ, you don't want to destroy the name of Christ by having poor credibility." And I wonder if that's the message that Jesus is sharing with us today. So I'd like to take this time to be able to share with you just what I consider as a framework for credibility as we see in this passage. So as you could see on the screen, I've listed credibility as that triangle that sits on top, and the pillars that follow it are these aspects of importance, intentionality, and being indispensable. And underlying all that is the whole concept of stewardship. My hope is that as we look into this passage, you'll see each one of these pieces that construct our credibility. So now let's just look at the first one. That is importance. Where did I get that from? What's the passage that maps out to this whole concept of importance is an aspect of credibility? Well, first of all, before we get into importance, what's the opposite of something that's important when we talk about credibility? It is being reactionary. Rather than putting things in their order of importance, what we see is a person that doesn't have a priority is he reacts to anything that happens. Whoever gives him his next assignment, that's just what he does without thinking about what needs to be done. If you were to look at someone in your workplace and you say they're reactionary, they just do what people tell them to do, and really don't think about how it should be done or what's more important. We're always looking in our workplace to be able to understand what are the important things. And so I think you can understand that a person that's reactionary would probably have poor credibility. And not only that, but what we see is a person that is reactionary, often because they have no real purpose in their life, often comes out to be a situation where they feel empty or frustrated because they're always doing just what somebody else tells them to do. I mean, I'll be honest, even working at the church as well as working in the workplace, those people who always talk about how busy they are, and you're wondering, is it really that you're that busy, or is it that you haven't figured out a way to do the things that are most important? Where did I get that from? If we look at the passage again, as I laid out for you earlier, that Jesus is traveling, there's a large crowd around him, and he says something that almost seems, you would think it's almost unbiblical, because what he says here is, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, and you're thinking, well, what's the Ten Commandments say? Aren't we supposed to love our father and mother? And yet Jesus is putting it in this way, that we need to hate our father and mother. What's with that? And I as I researched this further, the term hate is actually different than what we use it. We often use it as an absolute term. Now, there's a lot of hate that is going on, as an aside, in our society today. And hate is always bad. But what it's being used here in this passage is actually not an absolute term, but a relative term. In other words, you should love more things than other things. And what he's saying here is that our love for God should be the highest priority. And quote unquote, everything else is hated or falls in a lower priority of that. When you look at this passage, understanding that hate is a relative term, what you find is that he's talking about how we set our priorities. And how we set our priorities is to do the things that are most important. And that not only falls into the category of discipleship, but if we're a person that can't prioritize in our life, what kind of disciple would we possibly be? As I was thinking about this passage myself and thinking about it in the perspective of fathers that are out here, it's important that us dads understand the order of priority, what's important in our lives. And often that becomes a conflict for us because we're thinking work is the most important thing and family is important. And I think I've said it to our congregation before. There was a guy that actually I think is still the director of scouting at the Oakland A's. His name is Eric Kabata, and he had shared at one time, it's tough trying to find the balance of how to be a good dad, but also how to not cheat work. Because often when I feel like I'm doing the work that I'm supposed to be doing, I'm cheating my family. And then when I'm trying to do the things I need to do as a family member and as a leader of the household, I feel like I'm cheating my work. And that often is the difficulty that we have as dads. And all we can do is work towards that struggle and be able to fight against it, to find the right balance, but also to find and pick those things that are most important. If all you did was spend time with your family, you couldn't provide for your family at work. So I get it. I understand why there is that dilemma that we often have. Yet if all you did was spend your time at work, what you would find, and all your efforts and your focus at work, what you find is the whole reason you're working in the first place was really to support your family. And so understand that is a dilemma that we have as fathers. And all we can do is continue to do the best we can to put the things that are most important in our lives. The next thing that I want to be able to share with you is, as we look at this passage, is this whole idea of intentionality. Doing something with intention is what I mean by that. Well, if you think about it from a credibility standpoint, let's look at what's the opposite of intentionality, and that is aimlessness. That means you just do whatever that happens that day. You have no plan in life. And as I think about this whole concept of aimlessness, and as you think about people that are either in your family or your friends or your coworkers that live an aimless life, just like I do, that they have very little credibility. They're not folks that you can trust. They're not folks that you would rely on to give you wise counsel because they're aimless. They just do whatever, right? There is no intention in life as to how they would do things in a coordinated, methodical manner. Where did I get that from? Well, I think you probably know better than I. As we looked at this passage, we saw this whole concept of building a tower. And before a person builds a tower, he needs to plan. He needs to estimate the costs, to understand whether he has enough money to buy resources and labor to be able to complete it. Because if he doesn't, what does it say? Where's that word there? It says ridicule. He'd be ridiculed. In other words, he'd be embarrassed by all the things that would happen if he failed. I thought it was interesting. There's a guy named Jordan Peterson. You find a lot of his videos on YouTube, but he also wrote a book that I thoroughly enjoyed. I think it's called 12 Rules of Life. It was a bestseller. And in that, and he gives this talk on YouTube, and I'll summarize it for you this way. Basically, he's saying, when we plan, even a bad plan is better than no plan. At least a bad plan can be fixed. And he says, when we come up with a bad plan, and because he's a professor, he says, well, just write something. If you're writing a paper, feel free to write the worst paper you can. Because by writing the worst paper you can, at least you know where you can improve. And that often is the case. A lot of times people are paralyzed, because they don't plan. And so when they're paralyzed, what ends up happening is they do nothing. And so even having a bad plan is better than having no plan, living an aimless life. And I thought it's interesting. You'll see on the slide he says that in one of the in the talk that he gives, he's saying you're going to get smarter as you move forward. That as you start with a bad plan, you start to improve it. You're going to get smarter as to what things you can do better. And often we need to avoid the temptation to just do nothing, to live an aimless life. And that's what intentionality is all about. You have that opportunity even now as we're sheltered in place to be very intentional as to what you do each day. You don't have to sit paralyzed during this time. You can be intentional and be able to follow steps and do things in a methodical manner. So how can you be intentional? Let me give you a couple of things to consider about being intentional. And that is set aside time to think things through. Okay, if you're trying to set goals in your life, or you just need to know what you're going to do today, what you need to do, and this is what I often do in the beginning of the day, is I'll have my Bible reading, but at the same time I'll sit quietly to think, okay, what are the things that I need to have done today, and what are the steps that I need to take? And that's where the second thing talks about breaking those down into steps. And then after you break down those things into steps, perhaps you're not the planning type of person. And so you're not used to writing things down. And that's okay, as long as you can somehow take mental note. Okay, these are the top things I need to do today. And these are the things that take perhaps a lower priority. And as you start to come up with your bad plan, feel free to adjust as necessary. In Psalms 37:23, it says, "The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delights in his way." As I think about my father's story, it really does come from my father. Even though I was raised for the most part of my life as by a single parent, my mom, I know enough and remember enough about my dad for the first 13 years of my life. And I'll tell you, my dad lived a life of intention. Every day was very methodical. He would get up in the morning. He knew to make his oatmeal and hard-boiled egg and coffee, and I would just watch him do this routine on a daily basis. He was very methodical in terms of, because they didn't have microwaves back then, he would fill up a whole thermos of coffee. And, whereas most people bring lunch pails or bags, he brought a shopping bag, okay, for lunch, because he worked at a liquor store, was the clerk there, and basically manned the store the whole day. And so, he would bring enough food to last him throughout the day. He would heat, because like I said, they didn't have microwave, so he'd heat his meal, and he would put it in a little thermos thing that holds food. And I used to admire the fact that he was very methodical in the things that he does. Maybe, Dad, as we celebrate this Father's Day, you can think about what are the things that perhaps you can improve to be more methodical and intentional in your actions, because your children are watching. The last thing that I want to say of these pillars that hold up credibility is being indispensable. Now, I'm probably not using that word quite right, but if you think about this passage, what you see is that it's talking about this whole concept of the opposite of being indispensable. Now, most of us think about someone who's indispensable is you can't do without them. And I was so delighted to hear my daughter had her performance review, my second daughter that's down in Southern California. And they were saying, I have no problem with the way you work. I don't have to worry about you at all. What I worry about is that there are things you can do, this is your boss talking, that I can't do. And she joked about that, and it's like, oh, good, that's job security. But that's what, as much as our workplace doesn't want people to be indispensable, that we are trying to build a culture of teams. There are those people, that they do something that is uniquely them, and only they are able to do it in the way that they can. And I think that's what we're all trying to do. I know you folks are the same way, is that there's something that's unique about you that you could do, and that lends to your credibility. Well, what's the opposite of being indispensable? Well, I think the opposite of being indispensable is being expendable. Okay, that means that why are you even here? We don't even need you. I think that was probably and probably is still a fear that I have in the workplace, is that do they really need me around here? Is there anything that I do that is really that unique that they can't just get rid of me at any time? And so it's a terrible feeling to be expendable. And so you could already imagine, if there were folks that you know of that are expendable, well, they're not going to have much credibility. If we look back at the passage, as I mentioned, is that the Dead Sea, and that's what this represents, is that it says here that salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. It's like, hear this. If you don't hear anything else, is what that phrase is all about. It's saying here that salt that is no good is useless. It's expendable. And so how we want to be able to build usefulness in our lives, to be able to get to that point where perhaps we are indispensable. Now, let me just say this, and that is for our dads that are out there. That's a struggle that we often have as well, is how do we continue to be useful in the home? And I know there are times when I'm at home, there's some event going on and everybody has an activity and dad doesn't have anything that he has to do. And often we get into that feeling, as you probably do, as I have, is that we are so useless around here. Let me just assure you, dads, that you are useful. And in many things that you do, they are uniquely you. And you are, in a sense, indispensable in that way. Now, where do I get the foundation from of stewardship? Well, if you think about that passage that we just read, the instruction of Jesus to give up your own life really reminds us that our life is no longer our own when we turned it over to the Lord. And as a result, we become managers and no longer owners of our life. So it's important to manage our life well, because our life is not our own. And that's why I think stewardship is the foundation to our credibility. It entails the fact that we have a mindset that says our life is no longer our own. And so we need to give a good reputation of it for our owner. And what is the opposite of stewardship? Well, it's mismanagement. And I think we've seen enough of folks around us who have mismanaged their lives. And so as we're shoring up our house of credibility, I'd like to share with you one last thought, and that is the opposite of what credibility would look like. It looks like this. A house that looks like this is reactionary, aimless, expendable, and mismanaged. And as you consider this, basically this is a house that is not credible. So let's look at a few actions that we can take today or improve on so that we can clearly see how we are destined for credibility. The first thing is to set aside time in the beginning of the day to consider the 1 to 2 things you can do that would make a great day. I just heard a talk where they're saying, each day what we should do is be writing down the things that we're grateful for and the things that would make a great day. The second thing then is to break down those steps and that are required to complete the one or two things that you hope to use to make it a great day. And then finally, to consider whether the accomplishments you made are uniquely you as you live your life. Think about those things that you and only you can do. And that shows that you're on the destination to great credibility. So as I close the message and we proceed to communion, let me just say that credibility is a big deal. It's something that we probably never have used that word specifically in terms of discipleship. But my hope is that what you see today is credibility is needed not just for disciples. It's needed in our everyday lives as family members, as dads, as co-workers, as friends. And so my hope is that you live a life of credibility, one that actually sees what are the things that are important and orders them appropriately, that is able to break things down into steps, to live with intentionality, and that through doing this and your unique ability that you have, you become, quote unquote, indispensable. May God bless you today.